She had only asked a stranger for 10 seconds to wound the man who had just shattered her in a nightclub bathroom. But what Sloane did not know was that the kiss she borrowed in desperation belonged to a man who could burn cities down without raising his voice. And when that stranger looked at her like he already understood every fracture in her heart, the night stopped being about revenge and became the beginning of a tragedy neither of them could escape. This is not just a love story. It is a story about betrayal, emotional hunger, and the terrifying moment a broken woman mistakes danger for safety.
A retaliatory action was deemed necessary by the subject, Sloane Mercer. After discovering her partner of 2 years engaged in infidelity, she suppressed a typical emotional outburst. She approached an unknown male, chosen for his unflappable demeanor, and proposed a simulated intimacy for 10 seconds. He complied without question. The male subject's action was not perfunctory. He initiated physical contact, tilting her head with a deliberation that belied pretense, and kissed her publicly as if time had ceased for them. The intimacy was profound, deliberate, in a manner her partner of 2 years had never demonstrated. When he broke contact, Sloane was in a state of respiratory suspension. Her partner stood behind her, exhibiting a classic jaw-drop response of shock. She did not look back. The man met her gaze with a devastating composure and noted, 8 seconds, but it worked. What Sloane did not yet grasp was that those 8 seconds had initiated a conflict dynamic neither was prepared to resolve. I am Lena, and this case study is just commencing. Chapter 1: The Incorrect Kiss in the Correct Venue. The precipitating event occurred when the VIP restroom door at Noir opened, revealing a scene that deconstructed 2 years of her life in under 3 seconds. Mateo was present, his shirt casually unbuttoned, displaying the smile of a man with no sense of urgency. 2 other women were with him, one on the marble counter, the other holding a champagne flute, their state of dress leaving no ambiguity. The subject remained stationary. She did not vocalize or produce tears, a notable deviation from expected trauma responses. Reaching a self-soothing count of 10, she turned and exited without a word. The hallway's calculated, dim lighting likely heightened her sense of derealization, making the environment feel more unreal than it already was. The establishment's music rose in distinct layers, an auditory stimulus that could heighten disorientation. After approximately 10 steps, she encountered Bex, her primary support contact of 7 years and a tattoo artist colleague. Bex appeared as if summoned, demonstrating an emotional radar acute enough to locate her in the dark hallway before being asked. Bex observed the subject, then the closed VIP restroom door, and her face again, processing the disaster's magnitude without verbal cues. Bex then opened her mouth and offered the most functionally useless advice one can provide in such a moment of acute distress. "Breathe," she said. "I am breathing," the subject replied, proceeding toward the bar. The bar at Noir featured black marble with gold veins, lit to make any beverage appear sophisticated. She ordered a drink beyond her means, a minor, self-sabotaging act committed in solidarity with her own psychological chaos. A rapid turn caused her elbow to connect with an individual beside her. The man was tall, occupying space without effort, wearing a precisely tailored, dark suit. He held a whiskey glass with the composure of someone who had never been surprised by any event in his life. His dark, steady eyes met hers, and she attempted an apology, but the word failed to form due to a cognitive disruption caused by his intense gaze. "Sorry," she finally managed. He inclined his head slightly, saying nothing, continuing his assessment of her with absolute serenity, as if she were a component in a puzzle he was already solving. She moved to retrieve her drink. He remained in place. "Sloane?" Mateo's voice, a known stressor, came from behind her, his usually disguised accent now sounding like another layer of his fabrication. The proximity of his body and his cologne, now associated with the traumatic scene, triggered a subconscious, preemptive decision in her mind. She turned to the man beside her. He was still there, whiskey in hand, with the expression of an observer waiting to see how she would process the situation. She leaned toward him, speaking in a low, urgent tone that made it clear the stakes were real. "Please," she said, "pretend you know me. Just 10 seconds." The man observed her, then glanced over her shoulder, presumably at Matteo. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a subtle indicator of a decision being made. His dark eyes returned to hers. After a 2-second pause, he set down his glass, placed a hand on her face, and kissed her. The event must be analyzed. It was not a superficial kiss. His hand was firm and warm against her skin, and the other rested on the counter behind her with a calmness that belied the subject's own disequilibrium. He kissed her slowly with intent, like individuals who wish for every second to register as a declaration. For 4 full seconds, the subject experienced a cognitive disconnect. Erasing the champagne, the VIP bathroom, her romantic attire, and even her own surname. When he withdrew, the space between them had been altered, now smaller and charged with the residual heat of a transgressive act that had occurred regardless. His dark eyes remained on her, now holding a quality she could not name but could not disregard. Behind her there was silence. She glanced over her shoulder. Matteo stood with his jaw agape, his prepared excuse neurologically aborted, wearing the expression of someone failing to process visual data. His expression then constricted, his eyes narrowed, and he departed without a word, which was in itself a statement. The man beside her waited until Matteo was lost in the crowd, then looked at her again, a trace of a smile on his lips. 8 seconds, he said, his voice low and deep. But it worked. She retreated to the restroom with Bex, who seized her arm and began an immediate, agitated debriefing. "Who is that man?" Bex demanded, her voice pitched higher than the circumstances required. "Sloane, who is that man?" "I don't know," was the subject's reply, the simplest and most disquieting truth she could offer. Elsewhere in the venue, the man in the dark suit rotated his whiskey glass while another man approached. This was Soren Vale, older by about 15 years, with a guarded expression and the bearing of someone who had managed difficult information for a decade, understanding its cost and choosing his allegiance. "Do you know who that man is?" Soren inquired quietly, his gaze fixed where Matteo had vanished. "The one who was with her." The man in the dark suit paused before turning. When he did, his eyes showed not surprise, which was absent from his expressive range, but a cold recognition that precedes a calculated decision. "Matteo Varga," he stated. The second man waited, assessing the reaction. "Want me to monitor him?" "Keep an eye on him," the first man instructed. He then did something that clearly surprised his associate. He did not depart. He remained with his whiskey, his gaze fixed on the hallway where the subject had disappeared. His name was Kyle Rienzo, a surname whose significance was still unknown to her. Chapter 2. The Charade. No one should take seriously. Outside Noir, the Manhattan sidewalk was cold and damp, and the long queue for the club was a reminder of a world functioning normally while hers was collapsing. Bex was at her side with both their coats, her numerous questions held in check, understanding the moment required presence, not answers. The man in the dark suit was 2 steps behind them. His presence was uninvited, yet he accompanied them with a silent, natural authority that was more unsettling than it should have been. Then Matteo appeared. He emerged from a side door with a determined stride and the expression of someone who had rehearsed his speech. Upon seeing her next to the man who had just kissed her, Matteo's composure, his confidence, his entire performance faltered for half a second before he reassembled it and advanced. "Sloane," Mateo said, his voice calibrated to an apologetic but non-apologizing tone. "I need to explain what you saw." Then the same cognitive short circuit from the bar reoccurred, the same decision made before conscious thought could intervene. She turned to the man beside her, who was already watching her as if in anticipation, and spoke quickly, unsure if her proposition was logical outside her own head. "Would you consent to a simulated partnership?" she whispered. "For 1 month, merely until the subject internalizes the relationship's termination." The male was silent for roughly 3 seconds, a period during which she suppressed the impulse to retract what she termed a horrible idea. He then placed a hand on her waist with a firm, warm familiarity that was logically impossible, a fact her compromised nervous system could not then process. "Agreed," he said, and nothing more. Mateo advanced another step. The man beside me remained inert, silent, doing nothing but observing Mateo with the detached calm of a subject with unlimited time and no perceived threat. It was sufficient. I observed the precise moment of Mateo's psychological retreat. The concession was not somatic at first, but ocular, an involuntary recognition he clearly resisted. He observed the man beside me for 2 protracted seconds, initiated speech, aborted it, and withdrew. Bex's expression was unreadable as she whispered, "Sloane, I am unfamiliar with this individual, but you will provide a verbatim report in the vehicle." Cale's chauffeured vehicle appeared, its door already open. Bex assessed me for 5 seconds with her eyebrows maximally elevated, entered a taxi, and I was subsequently seated on dark leather next to a man whose surname I had yet to acquire. The vehicle's interior was engineered for silence, insulated from mechanical noise and external city sounds. The lights of Manhattan became orange and white vectors past the window, which I observed while attempting to organize my cognitions into a logical sequence. "What is your full designation?" I inquired, my gaze fixed outward. "Cale," he replied. I paused. He did not elaborate. I then turned to him and found him observing me with a slight smile I was beginning to recognize as characteristic. It was discreet, sharp, and indicated satisfaction with the developing scenario. "And the family name?" I prompted. "Cale is sufficient for now," he responded. His delivery was not evasive, but a statement of fact, like an unopposed meteorological observation. The statement was not open to negotiation. I sighed and returned to the window. "That was an aberration?" I said. "It was," he concurred, displaying no sign of regret. "I do not normally solicit intimacy from strangers in bars." "I am aware," he said, "and I do not normally grant it." The tone contained no irony or judgment, simply a fact delivered with his baseline serenity. This clinical detachment was more disturbing than any intended provocation could have been. The car halted before my building in the Lower East Side, which was anomalous as I had not provided the address. I began to inquire, but Cale spoke first, his eyes on the street. "The man you abandoned at the club," he stated. "Remain cautious of him." I produced a nervous laugh, a somatic response when the psyche cannot process the gravity of a statement. "You don't know him," I countered. Cale's gaze was direct, unblinking, his calm masking the processes behind his dark eyes. "I know precisely who he is," he said. I observed him for 3 seconds, trying to integrate his claim into my existing schematic of the world and finding no logical fit. I exited the car, ascended to my apartment, and paused at the door with the key in my hand, Cale's sentence occupying all available cognitive bandwidth. At 2 a.m, my phone vibrated. The message was from Mateo. We must confer. This is not concluded. I blocked the number with the preemptive speed used to secure a window against a storm, allowing no time for ambivalence. The next morning, he was outside my studio, leaning against the brickwork with an expression calibrated to appear reasonable. I observed him through the glass before he perceived me and for 2 seconds contemplated retreat. I dismissed the impulse based on a principle of ownership. The space was mine, and a prior relationship granted no claim. I entered. He knocked on the glass. I did not open it. He remained for 40 minutes. I confirmed the duration with a clock before he departed without a word. My phone then rang. The number and area code were unknown. I answered based on the precedent of Bex's unpredictable changes in contact information, a variable I must learn to anticipate. Do you require intervention or can you manage the subject? The voice stated, deep and low, with a slight accent I had not catalogued the previous night, but which now seemed impossible to disregard. I remained immobile in the studio. How did you acquire my number? I asked. There was a brief pause. Cala Rienzo resolves the situations he undertakes, Sloane. The connection was then terminated. I stood staring at my phone, the surname Rienzo echoing in my mind, its meaning a null set. Elsewhere, Cale placed his phone on a glass desk while Soren, his associate, watched from a window with an expression of a man weighing whether to voice a concluded opinion. You are deploying familiar resources to monitor a civilian, Soren stated. It was not a question. I am deploying my own resources, Cale replied, not looking up from his documents. Soren was silent for a moment, then made an entry on his phone. The active notation was itself a statement. Chapter 3, Deficient Simulation. Cale materialized at the studio on Tuesday at 11 a.m., bearing 2 coffees without prior notice. I understood then that the next month would be more complex than I had projected. He entered with the certainty I would open the door, which I did, my action preceding conscious deliberation upon seeing him through the window. He placed a coffee on the counter and surveyed the studio with a calm, evaluative attention I was learning to identify. It was not curiosity, but assessment. His eyes moved over the sketches on the walls, the furniture, and the workstation, then returned to me, his neutral expression yielding no information. You arrange your ink bottles by color, he remarked. By chromatic family, I corrected. It is different. He took his coffee and became quiet, and I understood he was not disagreeing but simply logging the data. The rules followed, which I had transcribed on a napkin, a lesson learned from Matteo that unwritten contracts are non-existent. They manifest only in the subjective version each party chooses to recall. I placed the napkin before Cale, who examined it for 2 seconds with an unclassifiable expression. There were 6 rules. No physical contact beyond what was necessary for the public performance. No unannounced appearances at the studio. A rule I noted was already breached. No unilateral decisions on my behalf. A term of 1 month, renewable only by my expressed consent. And the final rule, which I had drafted and redrafted 3 times. No contact, like that which occurred at Noir. Cale read the list in silence. He then produced a heavy, black pen and signed the napkin's corner with the solemnity of executing a 10-page legal document. I stared at the signature for approximately 3 seconds, uncertain whether the correct response was amusement or concern. You just signed a napkin, I noted. You presented a napkin as a contract, he returned. It seemed polite to reciprocate. The issue with Cale was his unnerving proficiency at this entire exercise. In the next 10 days, he appeared at 3 dinners, an event of unknown type where a table was reserved in his name, and a casual Sunday lunch attended by Bex, who spent the next 40 minutes sending me covert messages expressing extreme approval. Cale's hand on my back as we entered venues had the precise weight of a proprietary gesture designed to be ignored, and I noticed it. His habit of inclining his head toward me in loud settings created a private space between us, excluding the room with no apparent effort. I had to actively remind myself with considerable cognitive exertion that it was a simulation. Mateo was reacting with both predicted and unpredicted behaviors. The calls from unknown numbers ceased after I began a protocol of not answering them. On Wednesday, white roses arrived, which was notable data as he had never sent flowers in 2 years of our liaison. He appeared near the studio twice more, maintaining his distance across the street. There was a quality to his surveillance that was distinct from jealousy. A colder, more deliberate quality was perceived, though the subject could not assign it a name. She filed this cognitive dissonance among other unresolved psychological stimuli. The social function occurred on a Thursday, hosted on an upper floor of a midtown structure, where panoramic views of Manhattan served as a potent distraction from interpersonal analysis. The event's purpose was initially unclear to the subject. Cale had described it as a business dinner, a technically accurate yet incomplete classification. A dawning awareness of the environment's unique nature began with the observation that all male attendees shared an identical calibrated posture, not relaxed but controlled, each occupying a predetermined quantum of space. Cale maintained proximity for the initial 20 minutes. Performing introductions, the subject failed to cognitively encode due to the intense, information-rich nature of the conversations. His subsequent summons to the far side of the room left the subject isolated, armed only with wine and a growing sense of a systemic reality she was failing to perceive. It was at this juncture that she verbalized her disorientation. Soren was positioned 2 paces to her left, a recurring spatial constant she was beginning to register. She turned to him, the only individual she could reliably identify, and, indicating the cityscape, stated, "It's as if an unwritten map exists here, and I am the only one unable to read it." Soren paused before responding. With a flat effect, he delivered the information clinically. "You are reading it. You are simply using an incorrect edition." This validation triggered an involuntary, genuine laugh, a brief cathartic event. As she turned, she observed Cal across the room, his gaze fixed upon her, his expression neutral. His observation was unwavering, devoid of the decipherable expression she sought. For a critical second, before an associate in a gray suit reclaimed his focus, the quality of his gaze shifted, carrying a weight distinct from all prior observations. The subject registered this moment with a profound somatic disturbance in her chest. Across the room, Soren's gaze tracked from Cale to the subject, then to a neutral object, his expression consistent with an analyst who has just confirmed an undesirable hypothesis. That evening, a peer named Bex initiated a call, forgoing pleasantries and proceeding directly to her thesis. "I require you to clarify a phenomenon," Bex began. "Because I observed that man's gaze on Sunday, and among the many gazes you attract, Sloane, his is a behavioral anomaly." "It is a contractual arrangement," the subject replied. "A form of theater." "Correct," Bex stated. "And you are the primary audience this theater is meant to convince." The subject did not respond. The ensuing silence was a familiar tool Bex employed, allowing for introspection. She concluded the call with the tone of one who knows the narrative's outcome and is merely observing the protagonist's journey toward it. After terminating the call, the subject attempted to sleep. At midnight, the building's buzzer activated. The voice of Matteo emerged, low and stripped of its usual modulation. "You are unaware of the forces you are engaging with," he stated. The subject remained silent, her respiration rate increasing. Matteo's tone was not of jealousy. It was not the expression of a male experiencing loss. It was colder, more methodical, an unnamed threat her somatic systems identified before her conscious mind could. She initiated sleep with the hallway illuminated. Chapter 4. The point where performance ceases to be simulation. Cale invited her to the mansion that Friday, his tone framing the proposition as logistical rather than life-altering. "For safety," he supplied. That single word in that context held a significance she could not yet measure. Her acceptance was reflexive, bypassing rational thought, a clinically relevant data point she chose to disregard. The mansion was situated on the Upper East Side, on a street where immaculate facades broadcast an effortless dominance. The interior was cavernous and elegantly dark, with acoustics that compressed sound, making it denser. A central staircase ascended with the structural certainty of superior materials. The subject paused in the foyer for approximately 5 seconds, absorbing the verticality of the space. "You are permitted to touch objects," Cale noted from her side. "I am aware of my permissions," she replied, and proceeded to do so. The difficulty of cohabiting a space with Cale Rienzo for a weekend was the space's inadequacy to diffuse the hyper-awareness of his location at all times. A shift in atmospheric pressure, or perhaps the unique sound of his footfalls, would signal his entry into a room. Her attentional system would reorient automatically. She dedicated Saturday morning to exploration, focusing on the library. Here, books were shelved by size, a visually logical but intellectually dissatisfying system. She began reorganizing the collection by color, an unconscious, compulsive act. Upon realizing her behavior, 2 shelves were already complete. Cale materialized in the doorway, observing for a duration too long for casual passage, yet too short for direct confrontation. His gaze held that expression she was beginning to catalog. It was neither irritation nor approval, but an intermediate state for which she lacked the vocabulary. "That constitutes a crime," he said. "It is an aesthetic correction," she countered, her focus on the shelf. A beat of silence. "Do you intend to reorganize the entire library?" "That depends on the duration of my stay," she stated. Only after speaking did she register the statement's dual, unplanned implications. Cale did not reply. When he looked again, he was gone, but the query itself seemed to linger in the room. That Saturday evening was for a public performance, the type documented in society pages with understated photographs. She prepared in her designated room, using a gold-framed mirror that cast a warm light, and descended the stairs in a moss-green dress of uncertain suitability. It was suitable. Cale waited in the foyer, and as she descended, his gaze held a new quality, something less guarded and nearer to the surface. He made no comment on her attire, but his attentive gesture in opening the door communicated what he had withheld verbally. During the intermission, Vivienne Lacroix appeared. The subject saw her first. Tall, blonde, her posture projecting an awareness of being perpetually observed. She moved toward Cale through the lobby with the ease of someone following a memorized path, touching his arm with a proprietary gesture and kissing his cheek in an act of territorial declaration. "Cale." Her accent was a soft, controlled French. "It has been some time." "Vivienne," he replied, his tone neutral to the point of clinical coldness. Her eyes then shifted to the subject, her polite smile belying the incisive nature of her assessment as she said, just loud enough to be heard, "How long does this phase typically last? 2 months, 3? Do not be concerned, darling." He invariably returns to the familiar. As the subject was processing this assault, Cale's arm encircled her waist with firm, deliberate pressure, and he leaned in, his mouth near her temple, murmuring something inaudible to Vivian. The words were lost as the proximity overloaded the subject's cognitive capacity, but their effect was clear. Vivian's smile faltered for one measurable second before she re-established full composure, a well-practiced recovery. She departed without farewell. The subject was left with the somatic imprint of Cale's arm, a sensation she understood would be difficult to cognitively suppress later. Back at the mansion near midnight, they converged on the terrace through mutual, unspoken agreement. It was a neutral ground to postpone an inevitable discussion. Below, Manhattan was a grid of light. The cold air prompted the subject to cross her arms, while Cale stood a pace and a half away, leaning on the railing. "You are going to question me about her," he stated, not as an inquiry, but as a fact. "I was considering it," she conceded. He observed the city for a moment before speaking, his tone altered. It was not vulnerability precisely, but rather the dissolution of the usual barrier between his internal state and his verbal output. "She desired the cachet of my name," Cale stated, "but not my substance." He added, "The two are distinct entities." I remained silent. He proceeded without prompting. "You are the first individual in years to be unaware of my name's significance," he observed, "and I find myself without a protocol for that." The chill on the terrace seemed to recede. My focus settled on his profile, the severe angle of his mandible, his stillness during moments of consequence, and an attraction I could no longer rationalize as purely situational, a byproduct of the kiss at noir that had fostered a false sense of intimacy. He turned and met my gaze. The subsequent moment possessed a palpable weight, a somatic pressure in my chest and throat, an acute awareness of a proximity too charged to be neutral. Cale's eyes fell to my mouth for a fraction of a second. My respiration ceased. He remained motionless, and the space between us was saturated with unvoiced tensions. Cale's phone vibrated. He retrieved it unhurriedly, assessed the screen, and the expression he had worn reverted to its typical state. Deeper, more shielded. He answered, absorbed the information, and upon ending the call, his dark eyes held a new quality. It was not alarm. It was an emotion colder and more primal than alarm. "What is the matter?" I inquired. Cale observed me for 2 seconds before responding. "Mateo Vargas was observed conducting surveillance on your apartment," he said, accompanied by 2 armed men. The cold returned instantaneously. Chapter 5. Second Impact, The Fall. I returned to my apartment on Monday morning, driven by a professional deadline for a client awaiting sketches by Wednesday, and because remaining in Cale's mansion with the terrace incident so vivid was not a state conducive to cognitive focus, I articulated my need for my own workspace with my personal materials, absent the oppressive influence of his architecture on my thoughts. He offered no objection, simply observing me with his calm focus before agreeing, an acquiescence so complete it activated my suspicion. My apartment was as I had left it, moderately disordered, sketches on the table, 2 coffee mugs on the counter. I inhaled deeply upon entry. The olfactory signature of my own territory had a centering effect against the external chaos. Bex arrived 40 minutes later with pastries and the contained energy of someone whose inquiries had been deferred since Friday and had now reached their breaking point. We dedicated the morning to work, she on her laptop, I at my table in a state of productive silence that occurs only between individuals comfortable without constant vocalization. What I was unaware of while finishing a sketch was that two of Kale's operatives were deployed below, one in the lobby disguised as a courier, the other in a vehicle with an unobstructed view of the entrance. Soren had orchestrated this without my knowledge, and Kale had authorized it under the same condition. I would have vetoed the measure, which is likely why it was concealed. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I experienced hunger, and with the refrigerator bare, I took my key and descended via the rear service exit. I habitually used that egress for expediency, as it offered faster access to the side street. It was a 2-minute walk to the alley and 3 additional blocks to the market. I did not know that this route was a blind spot for Kale's surveillance, or that the resident of 4B, whose gaze aversion I had misread as shyness, had been documenting my patterns for weeks and relaying them to Matteo with the precision of a paid informant. Matteo was located half a block from the market. He materialized as if by chance, yet his movements were deliberate, exhibiting the precision of one who has waited days for an opportune moment. His hands were pocketed, his expression calibrated in the same manner I had observed at Noir, always controlled, always detached from the emotion he was simulating. "Sloane," he said, the tone suggesting a planned appointment. I stopped. "Matteo, there is nothing to discuss. You are making an error," I said. He advanced on me. "You are ignorant of this man's identity, what he signifies, and the world you are entering." "I am entering my own life," I stated, attempting to move past him. He seized my arm. The pressure Matteo applied was not born of jealousy. It was an act of non-negotiable control. He pulled me closer, his other hand moving toward my face. I anticipated his intent instantly and broke free, driving my elbow into his chest with the technique Bex had taught me during a training session that was now proving its utility. Matteo recoiled, more from surprise than impact, his expression hardening into something more dangerous than overt anger. It was a cold, calculating look of tactical reevaluation. Then Kale was present. He did not run. This was the first detail I registered, and it remained with me. He approached Matteo with a measured pace and a calm that was the most unsettling human state I had ever witnessed. There was no urgency, only the profound serenity of an individual with absolute certainty of purpose, requiring no velocity for validation. 2 men emerged from the periphery, silent and positioned with tactical precision. Matteo observed them and ceased all movement. Kale halted 1 meter from him and simply looked, his presence alone projecting the full weight of the Rienzo name, a weight whose true measure I was just beginning to comprehend. Matteo returned Kale's gaze with a hatred that was not impulsive. It was chronic, specific, and calculated, the kind of animosity one preserves as a strategic resource. Then he spoke, his voice low and precise. "You are on territory that is not your own, Rienzo." He used the surname with the familiarity of someone who understood its context in a world separate from mine. The statement landed with a physical weight in my chest. It was data about Matteo that I could not integrate into any existing framework. Kyle did not reply. The 2 operatives advanced, and Matteo complied without resistance, a fact I would later find more disturbing than a fight, as it signaled he was already planning his next move. At the mansion, I made a demand for an explanation. Kyle offered a partial truth, calibrated to inform me sufficiently without inducing panic. He confirmed he had formidable enemies. Matteo was an associate of dangerous individuals who employed armed surveillance and internal informants. I was not safe without an escort. He never used the word mafia. I never asked because a part of my psyche resisted that reality. My primary conclusion was this: Matteo knew Cale's identity. Cale knew Matteo's. Neither had disclosed this fact, leaving me as the only variable in the equation operating with a critical information deficit. I retreated to my room and stared at the wall until the silence grew heavy. During this interval, Soren knocked, his expression that of a bearer of ill tidings who has concluded no moment is opportune. Matteo has disappeared, he stated plainly. The men escorting him were discovered 2 blocks away, disarmed. An extraction team with significant resources removed him in less than 10 minutes. He paused. He had external support we failed to identify. My error. Soren's admissions of error were rare. This one conveyed the severity of the intelligence failure more than any operational summary could. Just then, my phone alerted me to a social media mention from a society page I followed, for reasons now obscure to me. The photograph showed me exiting the mansion one morning last week, my hair damp, wearing Cale's coat. The caption noted with elegant venom that Mr. Rienzo was seemingly amused by a temporary novelty of less conventional origin. Vivian Lacroix had registered her approval 30 seconds after publication. I began to pack. The decision was not emotional, but tactical. I was a tattooist from the Lower East Side, caught in an escalating scenario that began with a 10-second deception and now featured me in gossip columns that derided my social standing. This was not a contingency for which I had planned. It violated the terms of our unspoken arrangement. My bag was open on the bed when Cale knocked. I let him in. He glanced at the bag, then at me, his face devoid of surprise. His expression was one of fatigue, more authentic than the persona he maintained for public consumption. You will remain here until your safety is confirmed, he stated. You don't issue my directives, I countered. After a brief pause, his voice, now a lower register and stripped of its usual defenses, replied, No, but your well-being is my concern. I observed him for 3 seconds, the hallway's silence carrying the weight of our unarticulated conflict. The open suitcase on the bed behind me suddenly felt like a commitment I was ambivalent about honoring. I am aware it was Vivian, he declared before I could formulate a response, and I am resolving it. I require no one to resolve my affairs, I said. I am not a pathology to be cured. I am not treating you like a problem, Cale responded. Music. A notable variance in his tone differentiated this from previous interactions. Absent its typical layer of control and calculated detachment, the statement was direct, unadorned. I am treating you as an individual of significance. I was ill-equipped to process this, so my response was inaction. I remained in the doorway, my hand on the handle, under his direct observation. The quiet between us was the kind that demanded a reply but would provisionally accept none. Will you confront her? I finally inquired. I am already on my way, he said, then departed. I did not descend. I stayed in the room, the bag still open on the bed, neither closing nor unpacking it. I occupied that liminal state. It is where one remains when angered by circumstances, but suspecting that withdrawal does not resolve the core conflict. It merely removes you from its proximity. I registered Cale's departure through the main entrance 40 minutes later, the sound of the car receding. I then moved to the bedroom window, observing the tree-lined Upper East Side street, the suitcase a still open variable behind me. Cale returned an hour later. I was in the kitchen preparing tea, the only activity that felt sufficiently neutral for my psychological state. His footsteps echoed in the marble hall before his form appeared in the doorway. It is resolved, he announced. What was your communication with her? I asked. He moved to the counter, took a glass, and opened the refrigerator. I communicated that any action against you would precipitate consequences she is not prepared to face. A pause. Music. And that she no longer has a place in this life, irrespective of your presence. My hand holding the cup froze. You stated that? I did, he confirmed with his typical serenity, as if presenting a simple fact and not a declaration that fundamentally altered the ground beneath me. Vivian was being removed from the scenario, either by choice or by a cost-benefit analysis. Her return was not a variable. Cale had made this move without knowing if I would unpack the bag or depart. That, too, was crucial data. I set the cup on the counter and studied him briefly. Thank you. Music, I said, lacking a more precise term. He returned my gaze, his expression unguarded when not actively suppressing it, and said nothing. Yet his silence held the same quality as the one on the terrace the night before. Charged, deliberate, containing a mutual, unspoken acknowledgement felt on an identical frequency. Then a phone rang from an adjacent room, and Zoran materialized in the kitchen entrance, his expression that of someone withholding negative information while assessing the optimal time for its delivery. Apparently, the optimal time was immediate. Matteo has vanished, Soren reported, his gaze fixed on Cale. His security detail was found neutralized 2 blocks from here. He had external assistance positioned. It was executed swiftly. Cale remained still, placing his glass on the counter with methodical care. I recognized this pattern. It was his process for internalizing a threat with the gravity it warranted. Time elapsed since he left the street? Cale inquired. Under 10 music minutes, Soren replied. The subsequent silence was qualitatively different from the one preceding it. This one was textured with suppressed urgency. I already understood its implications. Soren had informed me earlier with the same dispassionate tone he used for all critical intelligence. But witnessing Cale process the information was a different experience than receiving it myself. The way he became motionless, his cold focus directed inward, made the danger more tangible than any operational briefing. I watched him. He looked back at me with an expression I could now interpret as genuine care. Not paternalism, but a concern stemming from a desire for one's safety and the awareness that this desire has practical repercussions. You will remain here tonight, he said. It was not a command, but the logical outcome of a risk assessment he had performed, one which I, if honest, music had already reached. I did not unpack my luggage that night, but neither did I secure it for departure. Chapter 6, Emotional Payoff. Music, I remained. It was not a formal decision. The suitcase stayed open on the bed, its zipper undone, and I stayed at the mansion with the quiet rationale of one who understands that leaving now would be a flight response masquerading as a choice. I had learned through negative reinforcement that confusing the 2 states leads to poor outcomes. We had dinner in the kitchen, where the cutting board showed signs of long use under the warm lighting. It was the sole room in the mansion that felt genuinely inhabited. Cale, at the counter with his sleeves rolled to his elbows, presented a different facet of his persona, still formidable, his presence still reorganizing the space, but with one less defensive layer between himself and the world. Soren had departed after relaying the intelligence on Matteo. We were alone with the mansion's silence, which possessed a deeper, more palpable quality at night, as if the rooms expanded when only we were left to occupy the void. He prepared pasta. I sat on a high counter stool with wine and observed him. The act was so unexpectedly domestic that I required a moment to reconcile this image with the man I saw regard Matteo with the detached calm of someone who eliminates threats. "You possess culinary skills," I observed. Music. It was a statement, not an inquiry. "My mother did not abide men who couldn't," he replied, his focus fixed on the pan. "Italian?" I queried. "Neapolitan," he clarified. His tone held a quality approaching tenderness, a contained variant, the only mode Cale Rienzo seemed to operate in. "She would have also reorganized the books by color, likely with more rigor than you." I laughed, the sound emerging lighter than my emotional state would have predicted, and clear his throat. Cale inclined his head slightly toward me, a rare corner of a smile appearing, which always disarmed me. We ate informally, plates on the counter, and the conversation unfolded slowly before gaining momentum. Not from a forced effort, but because both parties held things rarely vocalized, and the setting provided an opening that had not previously existed. He spoke of Nico without direct prompting, saying the name with the ease of someone who is always present, even when physically absent. The younger brother, 22 at his death, whose energy occupied twice his physical space. Killed in an ambush 5 years prior in a territorial conflict whose complexities I didn't grasp, but which left a mark on Cale that was more than simple grief. It was guilt, the kind that persists when you believe you should have foreseen it, that your role as an older brother was to protect. And you failed. "You never identified who gave the order," I stated. It was not a query, but a conclusion drawn from his subtext. "Never," he confirmed, falling into the specific quiet of a person who has carried an unresolved question for so long it has become a structural part of his identity. I studied my wine glass for a moment before verbalizing something I rarely disclose, for lack of a necessary context. "My father abandoned us when I was 12, I said. "He didn't die, he left, which is a more complex pathology. There is no clean bereavement, only the protracted process of understanding it wasn't about you, while simultaneously internalizing that it was for years." Cale observed me with the complete attention he reserved for significant matters, not formulating a reply, but simply processing. "That is the reason I remained with Matteo for so long," I added, the words flowing with surprising ease, as something in the kitchen that night made candor less difficult. I conflated stability with affection, believing I had found someone who would not abandon me, a fundamentally flawed criterion. The ensuing silence was the type that fosters intimacy, not by intent, but because two individuals sharing truths now occupy a different interpersonal space. He rose for more wine, and I moved with him, the action occurring below the level of conscious thought. The subject rose, moving to the counter and creating an unplanned proximity to Cale. Neither individual retreated from this spontaneous breach of personal space. A stasis occurred, the kitchen's auditory landscape replaced by a potent silence, indicating a non-verbal transfer of significant emotional data. Cale's gaze presented a reduced affective filter, a state the subject had learned to associate with imminent emotional disclosure. He inclined his head with deliberate slowness, a gesture granting her agency in the escalating event. His focus shifted to her mouth, triggering her physiological stress response, dysregulated breathing, and a cognitive fixation on the reality of the moment, distinguishing it from past, performative interactions like the 10 seconds at Noir. He then initiated a kiss, qualitatively different from the one at the club. The Noir event was driven by contextual urgency and performative intent. This act, however, was directed solely at the subject, slower, more profound. His hand placement was congruent, yet lacked coercion, while his other hand established a physical boundary. his body radiating a palpable heat that registered without direct contact. The kiss was a self-contained emotional event, yet it simultaneously induced a generalized, potent desire for more. The subject's hand was on his jacket, a non-conscious action, as his focused attention caused a rapid decline in her structured thought processes, just as the kitchen door opened. Soren entered without preamble, took 2 steps, cognitively processed the scene, and withdrew with a tactical efficiency that was remarkable. His heel impacted the doorframe, followed by an Italian phrase whose hostile tone was unmistakable. Cale and the subject broke their proximity. A brief silence followed before the subject exhibited an involuntary laughter response, a physiological release to a situation perceived as both absurd and emotionally significant. In turn, Cale displayed a genuine smile, a novel expression that altered his entire countenance, creating a powerful and lasting psychological imprint on the subject. "Urgent intelligence," Soren announced from the hallway, his tone flat, effectively detached as if the preceding 30 seconds had not occurred. Cale maintained eye contact with the subject for a final moment, a gaze that conveyed both a promise and an inquiry, which she processed and stored without an immediate response. Soren re-entered, his composure restored, holding a tablet. He placed the device on the counter, indicating the screen with clinical objectivity. The display showed a map of Manhattan's South Port with 3 red markers and a name, Varga, triggering the subject's memory of a 2-year-long constructed reality of business dealings. "Varga," Soren stated, addressing Cale. "Activity at the South Port in the last 6 hours. 3 containers show registration anomalies with Mateo's personal oversight. This indicates a premeditated operation, not a reaction." Cale observed the map with his characteristic cold focus, a trait now perceived differently by the subject due to her expanded understanding of his psychology. "He's leveraging port as a tactical pressure point," Cale verbalized to Soren before shifting his focused gaze to me. This specific look signaled a desire for her comprehension, implying the next phase would be clandestine. The subject correctly inferred this signified a greater danger. Chapter 7. The Hidden Truth. On Wednesday, Cale summoned her to his office, his tone not invitational but declarative, indicating a decision solidified overnight which he intended to execute immediately. She followed him down the hall to a heavy oak door, which he sealed behind them. He then stood centrally, his expression deviating from its baseline calm toward something more exposed and accessible. "I am more than an executive, Sloane," he began. The subject remained silent, allowing him to proceed. She understood that interrupting Cala Rienzo during a critical disclosure was counterproductive. He then detailed the full scope of the Rienzo identity, its function, its power in New York, his operational command, and the real physical danger associated with the name, which had tangible consequences for human beings. His disclosure was precise, each word seemingly pre-selected, neither mitigating the harsh realities nor adding unnecessary drama to the inherently grave information. The subject listened without overt reaction. She did not cry or scream, subverting her own expectations for how she would process such a profound revelation. She responded with a profound quietude, which, as previously noted to him, was a more severe indicator of distress than any outburst. When he concluded, she requested solitude. He complied, opening the door. She moved past him, avoiding contact, retreated to the bedroom, and entered a dissociative state, staring at the floor for an immeasurable duration. 2 hours later, Soren entered after a perfunctory knock, more of an announcement than a request. He sat at the window, tablet in hand, exhibiting the demeanor of one possessing time-sensitive intelligence that superseded the recipient's current emotional state. I must inform you of something, he said, his tone uncharacteristically careful. Mateo Varga is not merely a lieutenant in a rival syndicate. He was the individual who provided Nico's coordinates for the ambush 5 years ago. He facilitated the act, but did not order it. The subject processed this information for 3 seconds before speaking. Are you certain of this? I am, he confirmed, and Cale is not yet aware. I am en route to inform him now. Soren departed, leaving the subject with the new data, which recontextualized Cale's morning discussion of Nico into a much darker psychological framework than she could have previously conceived. She required fresh air. The mansion, recently a source of familiarity, now felt oppressive, its dimensions overwhelming. She engaged in self-reassurance, reasoning that Mateo was no longer a street-level threat and the port was a separate conflict zone. She was, she told herself, in the most secure location in Manhattan, a rationalization distinct from objective truth. She descended a side stairwell and exited into the garden, unaware she was under observation. The garden was cold and silent, October light casting long shadows. She sought a stone bench in the far corner, assuming a posture of distress, elbows on knees, head lowered, in an attempt to regulate her breathing and organize her chaotic thoughts. The approach was silent. The initial stimulus was a hand gripping her arm with immobilizing force. A second individual appeared, and before she could mount an effective defense, she was being rapidly and silently escorted toward the side of the mansion, the movements indicative of practiced, time-sensitive abduction protocols. She vocalized a scream, but it was immediately muffled. She was forced into a vehicle, and the mansion garden receded. The destination was a warehouse at the South Port, its atmosphere thick with the smell of brine and corrosion and a silence characteristic of places not intended for human habitation. She was secured to a metal chair in the center of the space, wrists bound with 2 guards positioned peripherally. Mateo stood before her, his expression not of anger but of cold calculation. Rienzo will exchange your safety for his withdrawal from the South Port, Mateo stated, presenting it as an established fact. You have observed me for 2 years, she responded, maintaining vocal control. Do you assess me as viable currency in this type of negotiation? My assessment is he will not abandon you here, Mateo replied. His tone held a cynical admiration, acknowledging a sentiment in another that he himself did not possess, a revealing diagnostic detail. After a pause, Mateo continued, his voice lowered, as if delivering a long-held piece of intelligence. I am aware Soren has discovered my role in Nico's death. His gaze was direct. I projected that the outcome would be Rienzo's psychological collapse. The calculation was flawed. The subject observed him for 2 seconds. You surrendered his sibling. I surrendered a set of coordinates, he corrected, a clear case of semantic dissociation. This is commerce, Sloane. It was from the start, a concept you cannot grasp. My comprehension is sufficient, I countered. Kyle materialized in under 2 hours. The guard's autonomic threat response, a sudden postural rigidity, was the precursor to his visual confirmation. The side entrance then opened, revealing his arrival with Soren and 4 associates, their formation displaying a discipline born of swift, non-improvisational planning. He advanced to the warehouse's center with deliberate calm. His initial focus was a full diagnostic scan of my person, only then shifting to Mateo. In that gaze, filtered through Soren's recent disclosure, a new dimension was visible. It was not merely a dominant figure confronting a rival. It was the look of a brother. Mateo registered the miscalculation as Cale's operatives contracted the space around him. Pride prevented a retreat, but his expression hardened, shifting from a primary strategy to an unformed contingency. "You are aware of my actions," Matteo stated to Kyle, "yet you came yourself. A sign of weakness?" "No," Kyle retorted, his voice deeper than I had known music, and colder. "It is the singular response you have earned from me." Matteo submitted to capture by Kale's men without a physical struggle. A simple numerical assessment indicated resistance would only compound the negative outcome. Subsequently, Kyle and I were isolated in the facility's center amidst the odor of salt and encroaching silence. He closed the distance and began releasing my restraints with a focus that was both methodical and gentle, his fingers probing for circulation before loosening the knot. His hand lingered for a moment post-release, as if requiring tactile confirmation of my status before proceeding. I remained silent. He did as well. During the drive to the estate, the cityscape scrolled past the windows without comment. Kyle maintained a forward gaze for an extended period. Then, without turning, he laid his open hand on mine, a gesture of presence, not pressure. I allowed the contact. He then spoke, his focus still on the road. "I recognize you must determine your viability in this environment, but I require you to know my feelings for you are not a strategic component." I observed his hand on mine and offered no response, as no words would suffice for the moment's gravity. I did not withdraw my hand. Chapter 8. Climax and Resolution. I awoke on Friday morning to sunlight piercing the curtains and an unusual mental clarity, the kind that follows a night of subconscious emotional processing. Faint impressions from the warehouse bindings were still visible on my wrists. They were not painful, merely present. An unsolicited, somatic marker that concretized a reality my psyche was attempting to distort. For an unmeasured time, I observed the mansion's bedroom ceiling. I contemplated Kyle, an antithesis to my preconceived desires, a dangerous entity whose world carried unforeseen, severe consequences, yet who was simultaneously the most authentic individual I had recently encountered. Not in terms of complete disclosure, as he had not offered that, but in his refusal to project a false persona and in how his focus suggested I was the primary object in any given room. That, music I concluded while studying the ceiling, was a significant improvement. Bex appeared at 10 in the morning with 2 coffees and the suppressed agitation of one who, after a grave call, was consciously mitigating a panic response. Kale had summoned her. This datum came from her, not him. A piece of information I catalogued with the others. Seated on the bed's edge, she absorbed my full account. The warehouse, the ligatures, music. Matteo's transactional tone, Coyle's unhurried arrival with a calm that was both deeply menacing and profoundly reassuring. The familial revelation, his hand on mine in the car. Bex listened without interruption, a behavioral marker indicating she grasped the situation's severity, as an uninterrupted Bex was one engaged in deep listening. Upon my conclusion, she paused for approximately 10 seconds, a silence indicative of cognitive organization before speech. "Is your fear about staying?" she finally asked, "or about the intensity of your attachment to it?" I offered no verbal reply. Music, but the extended pause, confirmed the latter hypothesis. "It's the second," Beck stated without malice, her diagnosis precise from long-term observation of my nonverbal cues. "And you recognize the second condition is not a cause for withdrawal, but for heightened mindfulness." She remained for another hour, departing with a necessary embrace and an absence of questions for which I had no answers. I was left with the state's silence and a choice that had been finalized before my conscious mind acknowledged the process. Elsewhere in the residence, Kyle was in his office attempting to work. Soren had entered twice with documents requiring review, and on both occasions, Cale's gaze on the pages lacked cognitive retention. An anomaly Soren noted silently for a subject of his specific psychological profile. On his third pass, Soren paused at the doorway. "In many years," Music Soren observed, "I have not witnessed your focus so compromised." Kyle lifted his gaze from the documents, his expression acknowledging the accuracy of the statement. "In many years," Kyle replied, "I have lacked a comparable catalyst." Soren made no further comment, exiting with his standard efficiency. Yet the posture of his shoulders suggested a contained satisfaction, the only version he permitted. In the early afternoon, Soren knocked, holding a tablet and wearing the expression of one delivering a confirmation. Not new intelligence, but the closing of a long-standing case file. Cale looked up from the documents. "Mateo's prosecution is proceeding," Soren reported. Music. "The dossier was effective. There are no legal exits." Kyle remained silent for a beat. He then performed an act Soren had never witnessed in their years of association. He placed his pen on the desk with deliberate care, as if setting down a great weight, and stared at it. "And the Vargas family," he inquired, his tone precise, as precision was the only bulwark against the underlying emotion. "Lacking operational command and now publicly exposed, they cannot maintain their territorial hold." Soren paused. "The European syndicates have already offered to mediate. Their New York operation is concluded." Cale did not reply, his focus fixed on the pen for a duration Soren understood as a nonverbal processing period. Then he said, his voice low and stripped of its usual control, "Nico was 22. "He was," Soren affirmed, nothing more. The confirmation was sufficient. Cale rose, moved to the window, and surveyed the tree-lined street, arms crossed in a posture of profound stillness, processing the event's full gravity. Soren remained in place, offering the silent witness required for certain psychological processes that transcend verbal expression. After a time, Cale returned to the desk, took up the pen, and resumed his work. This was not a cinematic closure, but the only kind that exists. Silent, absolute, and heavier for it. Mateo was incarcerated. The Vargas were no longer a power in New York. The operative in 4B was identified and neutralized Thursday morning, Soren informed me with his typical objectivity, detailing the name, role, and duration of surveillance. I processed this for a moment. Weeks of casual encounters, the coffee cups, the timely opening and closing of a door. My threat assessment criteria had been flawed. Now, however, I possessed the knowledge to prevent its recurrence, and the individual who provided ambush coordinates 5 years prior had been held accountable with the precision Cale Rienzo applied to matters of genuine import. I learned these details later from Soren, Music delivered with his standard objectivity, but I retained the image he painted. Coil at the window, the pen on the desk, the office's silence. There was a component within it that Music understood without explication. Certain burdens have a different weight when they find their final resting place. I located him in his office in the early afternoon. I knocked, he granted entry, and upon opening the door, I saw him near the window, arms crossed, observing the street. When he turned and registered my presence, his expression showed the first instance I had witnessed of something approaching vulnerability in Kyle Rienzo. A palpable tension was observed, subtle yet definite. The subject entered and secured the door. A moment of intense, nonverbal communication passed, bearing the weight of recent events. The noir encounter, the signed napkin, the terrace, the kitchen, the warehouse, and the tactile contact within the car. The subject initiated speech to mitigate the oppressive silence. "I'm not going to pretend I'm not afraid of what you are," she stated, "but I'm more afraid of leaving than of staying," revealing a classic trauma bond attachment. He paused, closed the distance, and withheld a kiss, a subversion of expectation that increased her disorientation. He positioned himself within her intimate space, a proximity too charged to be neutral, focusing his full attention on her. His expression lacked its usual control. The subject perceived this as Kyle lowering his psychological armor. "I know," he stated in a low, direct tone, "and I'm not going to waste this." Later, in the hallway, their proximity was intimate, with his hand placed near her head on the doorframe, a deliberate lack of contact. This implied intention created a tension more potent than any physical touch. She correctly interpreted this as his decision to orchestrate their next encounter properly, which she found profoundly disquieting. He retreated, gave a final look she had learned to internalize, and departed unhurriedly, confident she would remain stationary. His assessment was correct. Case note: Chapter 9, The Dinner That Redefined Their Dynamic. The venue was vacant but set for service, with a sommelier who addressed her by name, indicating the engineered nature of the situation. Cale had reserved the entire establishment. Seeing him alone, her immediate assessment was that he was an individual who operated without half measures. He observed her approach without moving to meet her, his attention fully concentrated, this time with no attempt at concealment. The subject wore a simple black dress, its appropriateness a source of prior uncertainty. He offered no comment on her attire, instead pulling out her chair and waiting for her to be seated, with the naturalism suggesting genuine desire over social protocol. The dialogue shifted, becoming lighter and more candid, a space created by a mutual cessation of hypervigilance. He shared anecdotes of Naples, of summers with Nico, and learning to cook to avoid his grandmother's passionate but unskilled culinary efforts. The subject's laughter was spontaneous, eliciting a genuine smile from him, which altered his entire countenance. She reciprocated with stories about her studio, a client whose tattoo she believed she'd ruined, and the client's subsequent return for more work. Cale's listening style was noted as active absorption, not merely awaiting a turn to speak. Mid-meal, he set down his glass, his gaze signaling a shift to an important topic. "I want to ask you something," he began, "and it's not about pretending." The subject waited. "Be my girlfriend," Cale stated, his tone direct, presenting a genuine proposition without contracts or conditions. He then added, "I know what I am and what my life is, but I also know I can't imagine this life without you in it anymore." The empty room amplified the resulting silence. She observed him for a duration sufficient for internal processing, a deliberate cognitive pace reserved for significant decisions. "You're going to have to accept that I reorganize things by color," she finally responded. He held her gaze before replying, "I already had the library renovated." The subject laughed. He smiled, the resolution feeling simple and inevitable. He rose, approached her, and held his face close for a protracted moment before kissing her in the vacant dining room, seemingly unconcerned by any potential audience. In the vehicle, Cale's fingers initiated contact with hers between the seats, a simple gesture to eliminate unnecessary space. She accepted the contact, observing the city lights, the silence between them now possessing a more complete quality. At the residence, he escorted her to the upstairs corridor and stopped at her room. He looked at her. "You can stay in your room," he said, the phrasing clearly presenting a choice, not a command. After a moment, the subject moved toward his room. He followed. The door closed, though the pivotal sequence began in the hallway. It commenced with the slow placement of his hand on her waist, a gesture of measurement, and his focused gaze, which narrowed her awareness to that specific time and place. Inside, the room was dimly lit, with Manhattan visible as distant lights. A palpable tension from weeks of restrained proximity existed between them. He cupped her face as he had at Noir, but the intent was now private and authentic. She understood this to be the antithesis of performance. The subject perceived this as the most genuine event she had experienced in a significant period. Details of the subsequent interaction are withheld, but he was reportedly careful, attentive, and unhurried. He vocalized her name in a tone devoid of his usual defenses, a moment she reports as having lasting impact. At dawn, the subject awoke first. The residence was quiet. Kyle was asleep beside her, exhibiting a state of rest she had not witnessed in him while conscious, free of posture, defensiveness, or the burdens he normally carried. She perceived him as merely a man, a realization she found profoundly beautiful. He opened his eyes, meeting her gaze and observing her with his characteristic intensity. "Good morning," she said, her voice slightly strained. "It is," he replied with a smile. At 7 a.m, the subject texted Bex. "So," was the immediate reply. "So." Sloane Mercer. "I need details now." Elsewhere, Soren overheard Cale humming an Italian tune in the bathroom. He paused at the door for 2 seconds before departing with the faintest of smiles. Chapter 10. Cohabitation. The subject's life began to coalesce in an unplanned manner that she found preferable to her own designs. By day, she commuted to her studio with a silent security detail, maintained her business, and created designs. By night, she would return to the mansion. This routine simplicity fostered a sense of genuine stability, contrasting with her past distorted perceptions of love. For 2 days following the dinner, her suitcase remained packed on her bed, a symbol of her transient status. On the 3rd day, Cale noted the packed suitcase, but made no comment. That evening, he appeared in the kitchen with his whiskey, his expression indicating a finalized decision. "Move in here," he stated, phrasing it as a request, not a command. "I don't want you to have packed bags on my floor anymore." The subject's pause was long enough to induce a slight tension in him, an observation she found gratifying. "You know the studio is on the other side of the city," she countered. "I know," he replied. "And that I wake up at 6 a.m. "I know. And that I'm going to reorganize the entire library." "The renovation's already been approved." She regarded him for another moment. He had anticipated every objection with his usual precision, a display of foresight she interpreted as a compelling form of care. "All right," she conceded. "But the room is mine." "It was mine initially," he retorted with a hint of a smile. "It is now ours." I contacted Bex. Her scream was so audible that Cale, across the room, registered it clearly and sipped his whiskey, making no attempt to conceal his amusement. We arranged to clear out the Lower East Side apartment the next weekend. That evening found us on the mansion's terrace, the entirety of New York sprawling beneath. I was pressed against him, his arms enclosing me, and for a long moment the shared silence required no words. This all began with me asking a stranger for a kiss, I finally observed. He remained quiet for a beat. His voice, low and unguarded, came from beside my temple. "I'm aware." A pause. A sound judgment. I laughed. He drew me in tighter as New York glittered on, indifferent and oblivious. "This concludes Case File 1. Case File 2 has been compiled. It can be accessed for a nominal processing fee. Someone was betraying Cala Rienzo, but not for assets or territory. It was far more intimate. They were cataloging his vulnerabilities, his breathing patterns, his distractions, the precise moments he felt secure enough to lower his defenses. The weapon selected to exploit this was named Victoria Laurent, a subject with a deceptively angelic facade. Cale was completely oblivious. The man who perceived threats in every corner was blind to the real one. But Sloane observed it all. What she uncovered by following that thread was worse than anything they were prepared for. Music. Because in this dynamic, the cost of saving the king is often the sacrifice of the queen. As stated, this is a preliminary finding from Case File 2. To review the complete, unredacted recording, activate the first link in the pinned comment. The analysis continues on the other side. As a reminder, that initial link provides immediate access to the entire second file, ad-free and without interruption. The protocol is straightforward. The work on the second file is proving clinically significant, and further studies are planned. Here, you will find examinations of more extreme pathological attachments, true dark romance. The intensity of this content makes it unsuitable for public YouTube release. This secure environment allows for the presentation of my undiluted analysis, ensuring my most accurate work for you. Be advised that the public channel is no longer monetized, so this method allows me to maintain my research team and continue delivering these high-fidelity narratives. More updates will follow shortly. I await you at the first link in the pinned comments. Unfortunately, individuals have been appropriating our audio logs, copying the narrative, and reposting it on YouTube. To access the official narrative and be the first to receive subsequent installments, search My Stories by Lena on YouTube to find the authoritative dark romance material.